On this day, the 16th of January, 1707, the Act of Union was ratified by the Scottish Parliament. This act would establish the United Kingdom of Great Britain. 110 sitting members of Parliament voted for this, and 69 voted against. England and Scotland were now one kingdom of Great Britain. England and Scotland had a long and illustriously violent relationship, one in which they very rarely were on the same side in wars and conflicts. Scotland, being much smaller, much poorer, had always been on the defensive. Scotland was also in many ways very smaller than the map would suggest. The Highlands were the equivalent of like the Afghan mountains. No Scottish king could control the Highlands. So the Kingdom of Scotland was basically the lowlands, the coastal areas of the eastern coast, and down to the English border, from modern-day Glasgow to Edinburgh. And the islands and the Highlands, not really. The Western Isles, Orkneys and Shetlands, for many years were ruled by Norwegians and Danes. So Scotland was a lot more compact back in those days than one would think. Scotland, being a neighbour of England, also naturally would end up being a rival. Many invasions, rebellions against English rule, and because Scotland was smaller, it ended up being a fief at many times to various English kings. This changed partly when Elizabeth first died. James VI of Scotland, a Presbyterian Protestant, became King of England. He was Elizabeth's closest living relative, a cousin, and he was now a Scot in charge of his very, very wealthy neighbour. What he intended was to do away with England and Scotland and to create a kingdom called Great Britain. He even started using the title King of Great Britain. However, the English Parliament was a bit suspicious about this. Scotland was a much more absolutist state than England, and they were worried that James would impose a Scottish government on England. So they put this suggestion to bed. In 1610, James again tried, and again the English Parliament refused. They didn't want anything to do with this absolutist Scottish king. They were fine with him being King of England, but as long as he was under English rules. So the Stuarts decided, starting with James, that they would try to unite the churches instead. They'd start there, and then that would lead to a union between the kingdoms. This was folly, and it would eventually lead to civil war. James's son, Charles I, was the unlucky sod who ended up trying to push this union of churches. He ended up losing his head, and the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, better named than the Civil War, began and ended with a military dictatorship called the Commonwealth Under Oliver Cromwell, England, Scotland and Ireland were united as one, but it wasn't a union that was very popular, and it wasn't a union of consent. It was forced upon them by Cromwellian forces. And because of this, after the Restoration, the Commonwealth was disbanded, and the three kingdoms were re-established, and the three parliaments as well. After the Glorious Revolution in 1689, there was another attempt at union, but this time it was stopped by the Presbyterians, because again the Stuarts were trying to force a union of the churches. They wanted a more Anglican Church of Scotland rather than a Presbyterian Calvinist Church of Scotland. And the Presbyterians were having nothing to do with that, because they saw Anglicanism as not very much better than Catholicism. So that was out of the question at that time. Now, at this point in history, we see throughout Europe a centralization within the states that exist in Europe. So in France, we have places like Brittany and Languedoc becoming more and more centralized into the Paris elite. They're running things from the center. Local rules, local authorities, local regimes become less and less powerful, or sometimes are just abolished. You see the same in Spain. This is a kingdom of Castile, Navarre, Aragon, Granada, or Andalusia at the time. And bit by bit, the authority and autonomy of these places is whittled down by the central authority. So, and we can see it in the smaller states as well. Places like Saxony and Bavaria, Sweden. The state is becoming more powerful and centralized. And so the desire for a union between England and Scotland made sense. But also, it made sense because of the rules of succession. England had one set of rules which prohibited a Catholic from coming to the throne. Scotland didn't have that rule, even though in many ways they were more fanatically Protestant than England. So there was a chance that England and Scotland could end up with two different kings, and could end up going their own way and possibly being on opposite sides of wars again. So in England, it was seen as a possible threat that Scotland could end up going its own way. And at the time, Scotland was a foreign country when it came to England. So Scottish people and Scottish merchants, Scottish immigrants, Scottish traders couldn't just go to an English colony in Virginia, or in New England, or in the Caribbean. They were foreigners. And so Scotland was kept out of the English Empire at the time. So for Scottish merchants and a lot of people who wanted to take advantage of this empire, it would make sense to be united with England, because then the empire wouldn't be English, it would be British, which would mean the Scots would have access to one of the great empires of the world, which is what happened. Another thing, from the Scottish point of view, the Darian Scheme was a ridiculous scheme. It was supposed to be the beginning of a Scottish empire, Scottish colonial empire, and it was an attempt to settle the Gap of Darien, which is modern-day Panama. Now, for some reason, they chose the swampiest most malaria infested piece of land that you could ever think of to set up their initial fort, New Edinburgh. And most of the people who went there died of malaria and other tropical diseases, because that's what you do when you go from the northern part of Europe to the middle of the equatorial tropics. You die because you cannot survive without vaccines and treatments and medication. It was bad enough going to a place like Virginia or New England. Never mind Panama. Even the Spanish didn't settle that. They went up into the mountains of Colombia and Peru and Mexico and settled in the cooler, less malarious valleys thousands of feet up. They were not stupid enough to settle the coasts. But this Darian scheme was madness. And most of the Scottish aristocracy put huge amounts of money, some of them put all of their money into this scheme. They thought that it would make them a fortune. The Spanish, when they found out about this Scottish madness, started to attack New Edinburgh. All in all, it was a complete failure, and Scotland was broke after this. So from the Scottish point of view, they were considered foreigners in England. They couldn't trade or make money in English colonies. They had just disastrously lost all their money in the Darian scheme. And they also had half their country that they couldn't even rule. So for many of them, it made sense to unite with England and become a junior partner in what would then be a British rather than English empire. And so for the English, it would make sense because they would end any possibility of Scotland being a threat in any future wars with anyone. And they would also add about 1 million people to the Union who could be very handy in terms of joining the army, settling the colonies, running the colonies, which is exactly what happened. So, the Duke of Queensbury, a Scottish peer who was a favourite of Queen Anne, he was sent up to help push through this Act of Union. And it wasn't just one act. There was a treaty, and then there was about 30 different acts passed by the Scottish Parliament. About 15 of them were economic in nature and to do with various trading things between England and Scotland. And they also passed a Protestant Religion and Presbyterian Church Act, 1707, to ensure that that would remain the established Church of Scotland. They did not want an Anglican church in Scotland. So, after various bribes were used to grease various hands, titles were given out, and this is very normal for the day. It's not like it was unusual. You know, today, if you gave out bribes and gave out titles and offices and that sort of thing, that would be considered very corrupt. Back then, it was completely normal. So people who complain about that, ridiculous. And they also handed £398,000 to Scotland to compensate those who had lost money in the Darian scheme. So this was quite important. You have all these Scottish lords and Scottish bigwigs. They're out of money, and they're basically being told, okay, well, here's this money, and you can get it, and you can be paid back for the money you lost in the Darian scheme if you vote for the Act of Union. Or if you don't, well, never mind. You just have to be broke. So it did pass by 110 to 69. So that was that. Once the Scottish Parliament ratified the Union, it came into effect. 1707. Scotland was gone. Great Britain. The effects of the Act of Union between Scotland and England, creating the Kingdom of Great Britain, is probably one of the great moments in history. Definitely great moments in modern history. It created Britain, and it created the term British. And this kingdom was about to go and become the most powerful kingdom, most powerful power in the world. Scotland was going to do very well out of this. The Scottish Renaissance, you could say, began to flower. The Enlightenment of Edinburgh. Many of the buildings in Edinburgh were built during this time that makes Edinburgh look as beautiful as it does. Glasgow boomed, industry boomed. Suddenly they had access to all these different colonies all over the world. Poor people in Scotland could now join the British Army or the Royal Navy. Little lords could become officers in the Navy or the Army. They could become governors of faraway colonies or protectorates. They could become ministers in the government in London. Suddenly, the world was opened up to Scotland and the Scots. And one of the first things that happened, well, it wasn't the first, but it happened over a number of decades, the Highlands were tamed. The British Army came in, built roads deep into the Highlands, and bit by bit, they weakened and destroyed the clans and the clan system. Many of those men end up leaving and going to the Americas, to what later became the United States or Canada, and became part of the founding stock of those new countries. Scotland became more secure, more wealthy, and much more powerful. One interesting thing is that the Irish Parliament petitioned Queen Anne to join in this union. This was ignored. They seem to ignore a lot of things, the British government. But it was ignored, and it was only 93 years later, 94 years later, that Ireland was finally brought into the Union, which may not have been the best thing ever. But it is interesting that the Parliament did ask for this back in 1707, seeing Scotland and England becoming a part of this union. Would have been interesting to see what would have happened if that had been the case. So, on this day, the 16th of January 1707, the Act of Union is ratified by the Scottish Parliament, meaning that the kingdoms of England and Scotland would become the Kingdom of Great Britain. Come back tomorrow for more. Like, subscribe, and comment.